Howdy friends! Today I'd like to give an update on the unofficial version 0.4 build of my 2D action horror game, Field Day. I'll be covering a lot of new additions to my game as well as issues that have arisen and what the next dev build should look like. Right now, the plan is to release version 0.5 on itch.io as a free minigame slash roguelike of sorts and collect player feedback going forward into the following build, before ultimately releasing version 1.0 on Steam. So, let's kick things off with the UI. Implementing the main menu seemed like such a daunting task before I started on this new build, but it actually managed to be one of the easiest additions to the game. I highly suggest checking out Bracky's guide on creating a start menu as well as Game Dev Guide's video on making UI look good if you haven't already. I'll have both of those videos linked in the description. A very important aspect in designing UI in Unity, at least in my opinion, is responsive UI versus dynamic UI. These aspects of UI design may sound like they're the same thing, and maybe they are, and I'm just terrible at explaining things. But what I mean by this is that when creating a UI element, it's important to focus on when and how the player should interact with it during gameplay. In the main menu, for instance, the player's control is pretty much relegated to clicking around on a few static screens. Certain panels will be dynamically enabled and disabled depending on how the player chooses to navigate around the different submenus, but generally all of the elements in each submenu will basically go unchanged. However, for the pause menu, I had to take into account that not only could the screen be enabled or disabled during gameplay, but that elements in the pause menu could also be changed or added dynamically. This meant that not only would I have to design the screen to accommodate new elements popping in, but I'd also have to design the layout of these elements to respond to changes in the amount of available space within that screen. And that is where layout element components come into play. Adding a layout component or enclosing several elements in a layout rule set allows these elements to respond autonomously to changes. In terms of designing responsive UI, I found that it's important to know which elements should have responsive capabilities versus which ones shouldn't. Sometimes Unity's layout UI system can result in some fairly interesting side effects. After dipping my toe into the world of elegant UI design, I decided that I wanted to start fleshing out more of the story. As a result, I've been leaning pretty heavily into the shady corpo ethos that has been cropping up in a lot of current-gen AAA titles such as Callisto Protocol and of course Cyberpunk 2077. For example, terminals have now been replaced with job boards and corporate commissary shops. Diegetic gameplay elements make constant references to things like employer-employee relationships, HR, and job titles, all of which are meant to add a bit of irony to the overall setting. The main area of focus where the latter of the two can best be seen is in item descriptions, particularly ones that I've added recently like data logs, which are a resource the player can collect from chests stashed throughout the game world. Canonically, these data logs belong to Titan, the story's main catalyst as well as the player's secondary employer. Corporate wants them retrieved and sent back to HQ as they contain important information about the company and could pose an immense security risk if fallen into the wrong hands. Returning these data logs to an IT security terminal rewards the player with corporate data points. The player can then use these to request a promotion, which increases the player's overall stats. Essentially, these data logs are tied to the leveling system for the player. Most broader aspects of the story will be told through recruiters, which are AI partners assigned to the player who are charged with providing context of the world as you encounter new areas and enemies. Think Navi meets Cortana meets talent acquisition specialist on LinkedIn who sends you 5 messages about a potential job on the other side of the country without telling you exactly what you'll be working on or how much you'll get paid, but much less intrusive. At any rate, so far I've added 2 recruiters to the game and would like to add more in the future. I also plan on having recruiters tied to a specific consultant company that the player can choose at the start of the game, with each company providing unique starting equipment and stat bonuses. Sort of like picking a class, but perhaps that's more effort than it's worth at this point. Now that most of the story elements have been put into place, the next area I wanted to tackle was procedural 2D level generation. This was a struggle. Not so much getting the procedural level generation working, but more so making it performant. I went into it thinking that I'd be able to leverage Unity's job system as it seems perfectly suited for this kind of endeavor. Adding multi-threading to a 2D action game, what could possibly go wrong? Well, just about everything did at first. I've run into enough memory leaks due to improperly disposing of native arrays that it's honestly surprising I haven't had my indie game dev license taken away. At least not yet, anyway. On the one hand, there are several great tutorials on getting started with 2D procedural level generation. The other, most of them haven't been updated in years, and the ones that have don't seem to have ever attempted tackling jobs. Maybe that's for the best though, as I'm not entirely sure that it's even worth the performance boost. In all honesty, I should have known that converting something over to run on Unity's job system doesn't just automatically make your code multi-threaded. Yep, just implementing iJob and moving everything over to use native types sounded too good to be true, but as it turns out, you'll need the Parallel 4 interface for that. The thing is, Parallel 4 requires an array of native types in order to actually perform the whole multi-threading part of its job. But the code that I've implemented for procedural generation already contains arrays, which seems like it'd be a job for nested arrays. But unfortunately, nested arrays aren't supported using native arrays. Okay, but what if I just used a complex data type, like a struct? Would that work? Unfortunately no, because native arrays need to be disposed of. You can't have a struct, at least in burst compilation, that contains a native array. Thankfully, there are native hash maps, which do allow for native arrays to be used as elements. However, that would mean that the iterative logic that I've set up... Honestly, I don't really understand native types, and there's every chance in the world that what I've said just now is wrong, so let's just move on. For now, let's say that it's doable. Hopefully in the version 0.5 release I'll have finally wrapped my head around Unity's job system, but for right now, the only performance boost I'm getting is almost entirely due to Unity's burst compiler. Without it, level generation is just way too slow, and I think just dealing with the errors it's been throwing has helped me write more performant code. Now another fairly unintuitive aspect of procedural level generation, at least for me, has been figuring out a tiling method that would allow tiles to be placed next to one another programmatically based on rules governed by the service layer. Thankfully, there are rule tiles for just such an occasion. The setup process took me a minute or two to wrap my head around, and it's honestly helped me understand certain do's and don'ts of creating a tile map using pixel art. Suffice it to say, I'm probably going to have to go back and edit some of the tiles that I've made. All in all though, for a first attempt, I'm proud of it. It works. Plus I've got a lot of plans on how to take it further for version 0.5. Okay, almost done. Last thing to talk about is the actual gameplay. So starting off, you're thrown into the tutorial stage. The recruiter pops in, there are some items scattered around, and you start out with a weapon, healing item, and even some upgrade materials, which are all scaled to whatever difficulty you're currently on. Which reminds me that I still need to create the UI for selecting a difficulty, but I've got all the components like enemy health and item scarcity already in place, so I think that's another log to throw on the version 0.5 fire. You're initially told that you can interact with your surroundings by using the Q key. Above you is a terminal, and interacting with it should give you some basic background about what it does and why it's useful. There's also a door right below you, which you can open up and... complete chaos. The training facility's been completely overrun, you die, game over. If you're wondering, yes, I did basically just rip this idea straight from Bloodborne and Elden Ring. I'm really not trying to reinvent the wheel here. Shortly after your death, you're transported to the Titan Forward operating base. There's little to do here right now besides maybe level up and look around. There are a couple of shops, but most of the items, especially the useful ones, are going to be way too expensive, and besides, you've got a brand new world to discover in Field Day. Yeah, that's basically it. The only other thing you can do is head out to the procedurally generated dungeons, which are all broken to shit. Didn't realize how chaotic things would be having two opposing factions spawn in at exactly the same time, and for some reason the opposing contracting company, Orion's forces, just decimate the Neo-Mutants. After the last devlog, I ended up rebalancing them by bringing their health and damage much lower, since with their insane attack speed, they were pretty much indestructible. But now I'm thinking I've made the Neo-Mutants a little too weak. Orion's goons are supposed to be a joke, yet they curb stomp the mutants at every opportunity. Maybe there are just too many of them, or not enough mutants. Either way, giving these Orion guys weapons when they spawn in definitely made them way more of a threat than that generic stand-in NPC I've shown in my previous videos. You guys know the one, right? The one that says and looks like he's hitting the gritty when he walks. Oh, that's another thing, combat. It works, more so than it ever has in fact, but it's not fun, engaging, or satisfying to me. Basically, you just spam your mouse button and get stun locked until you die. I like the blood splatters and the different shader effects for different damage types and status modifications, but sometimes those don't even work. As you can tell, I've got a lot of things planned for version 0.5, but I don't think I've got all the pieces in place quite yet. Thankfully, this past month or so has really taught me a lot. Okay, bye.